Today we have a really great speaker, and I'm very, very much looking forward to hear this talk. Amir Shevat, who is a co-founder of Reshuffle. Amir has been building very successfully developer communities for the last 15 years for companies like Microsoft, Google, Slack, Twitch. Most recently, Amir was VP of Product and Developer Experience at Twitch. He was also Director of DevRel at Slack. And Amir also wrote a great book called Designing Bots. So Amir, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for having me. Should I start?
Yep.
Okay, this is exciting. Always fun to be in speaking in front of fellow developers. So if you have any questions that are urgent, just post them into the chat. But Sophia suggested that we do questions at the end. I'm gonna do like a 30-minute presentation. If it's super boring, you can like vote down, and then I can show you slideshow of my life in New Zealand. I spent 2 years living there. Might be more interesting, we'll see. Okay, so now for the obligatory, can you see my screen question? And the answer is, can you see my screen? Awesome. I have so many tabs because I used to be a Googler, so it's that's life. Okay, and present. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to talk today about building, measuring, and justifying a developer relations organization. Basically, how do you build, if you have a tool for developers or open source project that you want developers to use, it could be an SDK, an API, or anything developers. How do you get developers to be your users? How do you create a developer community? And the act of working with developers is called developer relations. Just like when you're a VC and you have LP relations with the people who invest in your fund, or if you're a big company, you have investor relations. The act of being a developer relations is keeping the relationship and working with developers on a specific API tool or an SDK. Let me start by introducing myself, and thank you, Sophia, for doing such an amazing job. I'm going to talk a little bit about the path I went through that got me here. So today I have a startup called Reshuffle. Reshuffle is a dev tool for enterprise integrations. Basically, I'm a one-trick pony. I only know how to do developer outreach and do developer products. That's basically what I've done in the last 20 years. And I've done that to several degrees of success. So now I'm doing it again. Reshuffle is basically, if you know what Express is an open source engine for web application. We are the equivalent for integration. We're the Express of integration. So if you want to integrate systems in your organization, you install Reshuffle. It's an NPM package. And then you have a set of connectors, and you can use this open source framework to create workflows and integrations within your organization. Very awesome and very free, hopefully very awesome. Could be bad, but let us know if it's bad and use it. If you want to hear about developer relations and developer product, you can always follow me on Twitter. So I started about 20 years ago, worked with developers on SharePoint and Windows Mobile, if you remember that operating system, working with developers on .NET, on the emergence of .NET, where people in the Java community coined the word .NET not yet. So I was on the .NET side, working with developers from enterprise into small developers on that stack. Then I joined Google, and I started the developer relations in Israel. And then I created a program called the Google Launchpad, which is now the startup program for Google. It was started as what my manager coined as a bad idea that you should do during your 20% time. So I don't know if you know, but in Google, you have a 20% time. And if you want, you can do silly projects when you're doing that. one day a month. So I started that as my 20% project, and it became pretty popular enough for me to move here 7 years ago to the Bay Area and to launch it globally. So we launched the Launchpad program globally, and then created another program called the Google Developer Experts, which is the ambassador program for Google. And then at the end of my time at Google, I manage all of Google's scalable developer programs. So Google Developer Group, Women in Technology, the Experts program, and so forth, so on. And then I joined a small startup called Slack. We were 80 people at the time, and we had 50 developers on our platform. We haven't launched the platform yet. We had 50 developers that were experimenting with the platform at the time. And I left 2 years later, where the company was 2,000 people, and we had 250,000 developers weekly, active developers on our platform. So I had hair before I started that. It was a crazy endeavor. And if you're not a data scientist and you think that I choose companies based on the colors of their logos, you need to differentiate between correlation and causation. And this breaks the pattern. Then I joined Twitch. Amazon actually recruited me to be the VP of the platform for a company that is just acquired called Twitch. Twitch is, for those of you who don't know, your kids probably do know. It's a streaming platform for people who play games. It started with World of Warcraft and then moved to many other games. And the key here is that Amazon wanted to create strong integrations between Twitch and the games that were played on Twitch. So when you're watching Ninja or Dr. Disrespect, you can bet whether they will win or lose. So we had to do things like integrate with EA, with Blizzard, with Riot, with Ubisoft, with all the game developers around the world. And also authored 2 books. One of them is on designing bots, creating conversational interfaces, things like WhatsApp bots, Messenger bots, Slack bots, all the way to Alexa and Google Home. And the other one is designing web APIs. So focusing on creating APIs that developer love, and how do you, basically, if you read that book, if you have read that book, this presentation is probably going to be very boring for you. Okay. So why do you want to do developer relations? Why actually create a developer community? And the first thing I want to say is don't do it. Unless you really have to, you should probably not invest in a developer community. Developer community is expensive. It takes time. It takes effort. I'm sure if any of you ever created a developer community, it is a big endeavor. Developer relations people are usually expensive because they're engineered. That means that they're kind of pampered, but they're not as productive as engineers because they don't write code. They talk to other developers. So it's basically, you're getting the productivity of somebody from marketing, but you're paying the salaries of an engineer, which is kind of, I don't know. If you really want to do it, then you should probably do it. Why do you actually want to hire developer relations? Why do you actually want to have an ecosystem? You want to have an ecosystem in places where it is core to your business to have an ecosystem of developers. If your business is Stripe, not having a developer community means that you don't have any business. If your business is Twilio, that means that you have to have a developer community. It's core to your business. Another example is that if your product becomes much more useful if you have a developer community. Apple is an example of that. Your phones are amazing, but if you didn't have Uber or Spotify or YouTube on them, it would probably not be as useful for you, and you would not probably pay the thousands of dollars that you pay for your phone. Android is the same thing. Salesforce is the same thing. Salesforce, with its integrations, Salesforce would not be as useful as a product if it didn't integrate into a lot of other systems, and that requires a lot of integrations and a developer community. So for 90% of the startups, you actually don't need developer relations. But when you do, it is very critical to your business. the top reason for us at Slack, for example, was because we actually started without a developer relations. We thought that we could integrate Slack into all of the other solutions by ourselves. And we actually hired a team to build the first 64 integrations ourselves. But then what we found is that it's extremely hard. It doesn't scale. There's so many IT solutions, we can't integrate into them all. And even if you integrate it into a solution, let's say you integrated Jira into Slack, then Jira released a new version, and now your team that created this integration needs to play catch up all the time. So if you don't have an ecosystem, building a platform is really, really hard. Okay, so now that we've decided to spend our money more wisely or to actually have a developer community, let's talk about how do you build a developer community. Before we talk about how, let's talk about who. Who is a developer? Let's define who's a developer. There's three, and maybe a little bit more, but there's three types of audiences when you talk about the developer community. Developer as a core contributor. You see this in open source projects like Linux, or sometimes in cryptocurrency projects, where every developer is an equal contributor to a code base. So let's say you have an open source project and everybody's contributing. That's one type of a developer community. So the major problem there around building this type of ecosystem is governance. Who makes the call? Do we add this driver or do we add this driver by default? What is the skin of Linux that we're going to show by default? All these things are around governance, and we could do a different presentation at a different time around open source governance. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the next two. One of them is developers as customers. So an example for that would be Stripe and Twilio. Developers come in, they use the SDK or API, and they pay for usage. Another example would be a developer as an ecosystem partner. So these are, you build a platform and you get developers to build on top of that platforms. These developers are partners. They don't pay you, but they make money out of using your platform. So it's basically, if you look at it, the most common, most successful platforms here are Android and iOS by far. If you look at companies like Uber, think of how big is Uber, and think of what would have happened if Uber didn't have Android or iOS. If we were still on the Nokia world and you had to send 2 million SMSs in order to coordinate getting a ride. Uber is a company that was built on the strategy of being an ecosystem partner to iOS and Google, to Apple and Google. So we will be focusing on the next on the two latter examples here. Okay, so this is the next two slides are basically, after that you can go to sleep, because this is going to be the test. This is going to be at the test at the end of this presentation. This is how you build a community. This is how you build an ecosystem around your product. You start by inspiring your developers. We tell them why. Why is this important? Why is this good for them? Why is this SDK or API or open source project the most important thing for them to be successful? Once they're bought in, you need to educate them how to be successful on the platform. If it's on Android, you need to teach them the intent system and the way that UI works on Android, and how to save battery life so that their application becomes delightful. Then you need to enable them. Enable them is give them the tools, debugging, logging capabilities, ability to monitor, dashboards, monetization capabilities. These are all enabling technologies that makes a developer that now is inspired and educated capable of being successful on your platform. And last but not least is capture the feedback and pour it back into the product. This is super important and often misused in big companies. Usually in big companies, they forget about the last part. They forget about the feedback. Most notoriously, when I was at Microsoft, Microsoft has changed a lot, but when I was at Microsoft, the role was called an evangelist. So it was basically like more like, praise the Lord, here's our API, where when you actually work with developers, you need to say, hey, here's our API. It might be broken, but we will work together to fix it. And that's that's called an advocate role. So if you're talking to an evangelist, it's more of an outbound role. I need to inspire and educate, but I never take back feedback. And an advocate role is a bi-directional role. They advocate the product outside, but they also find things that are broken out and feedback and bring it back to the product team. So make sure that if you do a developer outreach, make sure to collect feedback and improve your product. So that's the life cycle of building a developer community. Let's look at the mechanics of building a developer community. So whenever I go and I think about a developer community, I think about it in the form of a funnel. I look at the steps, and this is the journey of a developer on Slack. You can have your own journey depending on your product. So for example, if you have an SDK, monetize might not be important to you. If you're building an app, for example, monetize an Android, monetize is the only thing that is important. So Purnima Kuchikar, the head of developer outreach for Google Play, measured herself by money made to developers. So she only cared about the top of the funnel for developers. Okay, so now this is the developer journey for Slack. Developers are interested. Developers are building an app. Developers are publishing that app on the marketplace. That app is getting used, and developers are monetizing the app. Okay, now the entire mechanism of developer outreach is to write key measurements next to each step of the funnel. So for example, developers interested would be landing on our landing page on api.slack.com. That would be the metric that is associated with developers interested. Okay, building is actually creating a token. So the minute I create a token, I'm counted as a developer building. Publishing is I published my app on my marketplace. So for each step of the funnel, you need to identify what is the measurement that measures that step and tie it out, right? Write it down. So I would say for interested, it would be landing. Here would be publishing, creating a token, using that token to publish an app. And then that token is being used, and then some sort of monetization. So that's what you do on the left-hand side. You write the measurements for each step of the funnel. On the right-hand side, you write the activities that you want to do in order to move developers through the funnel. So next to interested, I would put things like write content, publish articles in dev.to, go and speak in meetups, go and speak in events, create video tutorials explaining why your API is awesome, and so forth and so on. For building, I would say create a one-on-one tutorial, create an how-to get started. Think about the conversion from landing into actually acquiring a token. Remove hurdles from there. So like next to each step of the funnel, you can think about activities that will drive developers through that funnel. And then once you have these on one side, the measurements, and on the other side, the activities, you can start executing on the activities and see if they move the needle and move your developers through the funnel. So every time you publish an article, you need to see how many people from that article land on your landing page, and that moves the needle for the top part of the funnel. And then you do more and more activities until you get developers through the funnel. So that's basically what developer relations is all about. This is how a developer relations organization looks. This is an example from Slack, but you can say the same for like the Google one is very, very similar. You have an advocacy role. We talked about that. That's a person who creates scalable content. Their job is to create one-to-many engagements with developers. You have the enterprise architects. That's more of like going and working with big customers and making sure that they're successfully integrated Slack into their organization. Partner engineering works with selected partners. They do one-to-few relationships and work with selected partners and selected developers on creating high-quality integrations. And content writers, these are the people who write the Java doc, people who document the API, people who create the very rudimentary tutorials and how-tos on your dev site. Okay, so let's take an example of one of the activities of developer relations, which is working with communities, and look at how different companies look at on community activities and how did that pan out. So what we're doing here, talking right now, is a community activity. Community activity is awesome because one person is talking, or many people are talking, and they're creating value just by being together. There is serendipity in communities, and communities that work around your product are very useful because that means that people are creating this value for your platform. So a community engagement is very useful when you're building developer focused. And developers are a weird bunch. We are friendly to other developers. We don't really like other people, but we're very friendly to other developers. So we want to gather together and talk shit about sales and talk about other technology capabilities. So the first use case that I want to describe is Microsoft. Microsoft created this very high-end community. It was called the Microsoft CTO Roundtable. You actually had to pay to be a member of that community. You had to be a CTO or a CIO of a company that had an enterprise agreement. An enterprise agreement was about $500,000, between $100,000 and $500,000 worth of licenses that you bought from Microsoft. And if you did that, you were invited to be part of the roundtable. The content for that community was highly curated and high quality created by Microsoft. So people from Microsoft were speaking in these events. These were very, very expensive community outreach because Microsoft paid for the venue, paid for the food, paid for the speakers. But because this was tied up to revenue, it was very easy to maintain this type of community. We could have every dollar that we spend on Roundtable, we could show how it was tied into ROI, to return on investment. So the learning from that type of community is that you can create a high quality, high touch and scalable community outreach, but it's very expensive. And if you don't tie it into actual measurements of making money, you will run out of money very fast. And you need to tie this type of highly engaged community in a scale way, you need to tie it into monetization in some way. The second community that I want to talk about is the Google Developer Group. I was very fortunate to run the team that managed the Google Developer Group worldwide. And it's an astonishing endeavor. Currently, there's more than 750 meetups around the world that meet on a monthly basis to educate developers on Google technologies. That means that Google basically does not need to go and teach those developers. That means that these developers teach each other about Google technology. Google spends zero money on sponsoring the location. Google spends zero money on food. Google spends a lot of money fostering the community in other ways. They have people that spend time fostering, finding people who can run these communities, keeping a relationship with them, inviting them once a year when we still had planes, inviting them to fly into Mountain View and to eat a lot of Google food. So it wasn't zero cost money, but compared to the Microsoft engagement, it was extremely affordable and much more scalable because everyone could create their own community. The downside is that because it was not very highly curated, we had different levels of quality within our communities. And we had something called the cookie monsters. I'll tell you how I found the issue of the cookie monster. I was told that one of the biggest community that we had in Rio de Janeiro had major problems. People were reporting that they don't like the content there. They don't feel like it's a good community. And they started doing like, yeah, we're gonna have a secondary community. We're gonna have a shadow community. And I thought that that was a bad idea. So I flew in to see how the developer community is going. And I went to the meetup, and the meetup I had a few people. I had like 200 people. And I had conversation with some of them. And then I ran into this problem of a cookie monster. The cookie monster is, I asked the person, so are you a developer? And what's your favorite Android app? And they would say, no, I'm not a developer. I just really like the food here. And I really like Google, and it's a Google community. So, and they give stickers. So I'm gonna come here every time. So what actually happened is that the community was made out of a lot of people who were not developers. Now, what happens when developers come to a meetup with other non-developers? They feel not at home. And then they start going away to other meetups. And then the content becomes less important, less interesting for them. So we had to foster that community. And for about 3 months, we only provided Google content that was very hardcore, like byte manipulation in crypto in Android. I'm just making this up, but like very, very hardcore sessions. And what that made it happen is that the cookie eaters just left because the content was boring for them, and more hardcore developers joined. So even if you're doing an open community, you need to make sure that you need to control and curate the content. You need to help your community leaders around the world choose the right content and have the right infrastructure. Make sure that, like, sometimes community leaders leave, they're volunteers, they don't have to stay. So have a succession process. So like, for example, we saw that a lot of developers after the age of 35 do not want to be community leaders anymore. So because something happens, they have kids and now they have a family and they don't want to spend all their time looking for speakers. They want to spend time with their family. So what we had is, like, for every community, we had a community leader and an apprentice community leader. And the apprentice community leader inherit the job once the main community leader left. So you need to build these types of mechanisms in order to have a developer community at scale. And the last case study that I want to talk about is the Slack community. And the Slack community strategy was very interesting because we didn't have any money at the time. We couldn't afford creating 700 communities around the world. We couldn't afford curating and creating content all around the world. So instead of creating a community, we hacked into other communities. Our benefit was that we were sexy. I'm not talking personally about myself, the brand was sexy. So we could go easily to IBM and say, hey, we're the new sexy startup on TechCrunch. Why don't we create a presentation about how to build Slack integration on the IBM cloud? And IBM said, yes, this is a great idea. We have a great community. Why don't you come and talk about your sexy topic? And we came and did the same thing for Amazon and for AWS. We said, hey, wouldn't it be awesome if we both created this content about, like, writing Slack bots on AWS Lambda? And the guys from Lambda said, whoa, that's a great idea. Because I just read about Slack in TechCrunch, and I'm super happy to create some buzz around my community. So we actually didn't create a community up until a year ago. Slack didn't have its own community. It basically rode on other communities. on the Google Cloud community, on the AWS community, and the Salesforce community. We collaborated with other communities in order to engage with them, rather than spend the time and effort on building our own community. So we didn't have a community leader for a very long time. Okay, so you can have a scalable, high quality, high touch community engagement, but you need to be sexy or any other advantage, and you need to work with other communities and be wise about who you pick as your company strategy. Okay, last section is how do you measure? How do you measure developer engagements? So let's start with the, So let's start with the bad examples. The bad examples are at the bottom. One of them is developer engaged. And developer engaged, or what's called in Microsoft and in Google, developer touched, is a metric that I don't find very useful. Like, first of all, touch developers on your own spare time. Don't touch developers while you're at the job. Second of all is, it's a very indirect measurement. I would say that, like, I could go into an event, talk about why technology sucks, and I engage all these developers, but they will never will never do anything useful with that technology because I told them how it sucks, right? So it's not an actual positive developer engagement. Same thing with developer registered. It's pretty hacky. You can hack it and pay Facebook $10,000, and you will get a lot of developers to register, but they won't do anything useful with your API or SDK. And then revenue is another dangerous one, which is because if you tie developer relations into revenue, you turn developer relations into salespeople. And that means, and the last person that an engineer wants to see is a salesperson. So make sure that your developer relations people are not tied into quotas, because then their incentives are broken. So an example of a good measurement is number of developers with weekly active tokens. This means that a developer has been inspired, has been educated, and is now using your product or API on an ongoing basis. Another example that we had is correlation. This is a secondary measurement, which is correlation between your actual paying users and usage of the platform. So we use this in Slack because it was very, very indicative. 97% of our paying customers at Slack were using the platform, and we're using the API. And we were really keen on keeping that. Okay, so we'll finish with lessons learned. When you build a developer ecosystem, think about breadth. Think about, like, how do I reach as many developers as possible, but also work with selected partners. See who are the partners that you can work with and work with them. When we were at Slack, our major partners were IBM and AWS and Salesforce. These are the partnerships that drove a lot of the work. There's a company called Sneak that does security vulnerability for your code, and they had an amazing integration with GitHub, so they could, like, PR your code and submit fixes for your code. So that's an amazing type of integration. So always think about breadth and depth when you think about developers. Aligned and measure the right thing. Think about advocacy and how you can collect feedback rather than just projecting out. Be a part of the community in order to lead the community. When you talk to developers, talk to them about what works and also what's broken. We didn't talk about where you are in the organization, but if you have a big organization, it is very smart not to have developer relations under sales or under that type of org. The best places to put developer relations is under product or engineering. Also, make sure that the money that comes to developer relations is dedicated to developers. So you need to think about that, like, as we said, like, DevRel costs money. And always think about the within. what's in it for me? Oh, there's a bug. It's FIFM here. I didn't mean that. So it should be called WIFM. What's in it for me? Why should I, as a developer, come and use your product, be a member of your community? I usually split it down to either money, love, and fame. Can I make money from your product? Is it going to be fun to use your product? Or am I going to be famous by joining your open source project, for example? So what are the motivations in terms of growth, fun, and other opportunities and branding?